Good morning and welcome to this presentation for Are You Ready? Climate Change and Asset Management and the integrations between these two factors. To provide an overview for the webinar, we'll provide introductions to the research team. The discussion will then look at the overview of the project and the context for the two main activities and phases. We'll look at some of the preliminary results from this study, which is the main focus of this seminar. And we'll look also at an overview of the future direction of the project, so they'll have a better understanding of what will come from this in the future. If you have questions at any time during the webinar itself or at the end of the presentation, there is an email address here at gmail.com. And at the bottom of each of the slides, this email is also shown, so that at any time if you have questions, please feel free to send an email. And we'll look at that at the end of the presentation. So in terms of the research team members that are here today presenting, it's myself, Sean Kenny. Catherine Dupre will also present later on. And Amanda McAvoy, who's a PhD candidate here at Carleton, will field the questions and then disseminate those to us so that we can answer them at the end of the broadcast. First, I'd like to acknowledge both the funding through the Government of Ontario, through the Ministry of Agriculture, Food and Rural Affairs, through NSERC, Natural Engineering Research Council, and Carleton University. The research project itself as well also has significant input and indirect support from the steering committee, both of which are members of the OMAFRA, Peterborough County, City of Peterborough, and Township of Douro-Dummer. And also we have research team members that are also involved with the project that are not presenting here today, but are actively involved in the project itself. That includes Dr. Murray Richardson in geography and Dr. Siva Thailand in the geotechnical engineering and civil engineering at Carleton. Also Mr. Joseph Chamberlain from Secor is also involved in the project. In terms of the project context, we'll relate this back to the main scope, which is related to rural Ontario communities. And the study focus itself is on core infrastructure. So that includes transportation assets such as roads, bridges, and culverts, and also water assets, so potable water, storm systems, and wastewater systems itself. In terms of the relationship with asset management, we're looking more primarily at how we can help the asset management process with respect to climate change considerations. And through that asset management process, the figure on the right-hand side is a classical figure in terms of how we look at asset performance or fitness, both the condition and expected performance over time in the future for that asset, and the cost to either do repairs on a recurring or annual basis versus the degradation in that particular asset in terms of its useful life versus delaying that type of action into the future with a significant decrease in quality and a significantly increased cost to bring it back to 80 or 90% of that utility. Primarily when we look at the assets, we're looking at trying to achieve some desired service level or goal, such as the average surface condition index or pavement condition index, such as PCI, or the number of connection days for a water main, for example. So how many days that you may have a break with a loss of service to the community. Excuse me. So from a national perspective, in terms of asset management plans, the Canadian Infrastructure Report Card recently released a study looking across pan-Canadian municipalities, which is shown here in the right-hand side figure, looking at different municipalities, the number of those municipalities, and the general population base that survey looked at. There were both lower and single-tier municipalities and upper-tier municipalities, of which 91% of that composite survey had in-place asset management plans. And this is consistent with what is in Ontario, which is greater than 95%. And this survey that was done by the Canadian Infrastructure Report Card represents 56% of the total Canadian population base. So in terms of climate change and extreme weather, I thought this was a useful quote from the National Academy of Sciences in the United States, which is basically describing how over time we've come to better understand both the relationship between global warming, local climate change effects and weather events, and how we can actually attribute those events to weather events to actual impacts on, say, infrastructure or natural environment or even species. In terms of knowledge base, we can look at increasing confidence and increasing understanding between the level of exposure of these events to particular outcomes. As we go from the left-hand side of severe drought to the right-hand side of heat waves, we see an increasing confidence in how we can attribute weather events with particular outcomes. We see this also in indirect evidence through catastrophic payout relationship with extreme weather events, such as ice storms, precipitation, wildfires or forest fires, flooding, hurricanes, tornadoes. We can see that from 1983 through to 2015, the catastrophic loss payout has increased almost by an order of magnitude, with an increasing trend since the 1980s. So this is also another indicator that there are experiences or correlations between adverse weather effects and also impacts on infrastructure, which is then at minimum causing costs to the economy in terms of insurance payouts. We also see sometimes that in local experience and weather events, such as the flooding in Peterborough recently in 2004, the flooding in the eastern part of Ottawa on Ontario, and also in Gatineau, Quebec in 2017, and also more recently in Ottawa this past spring in terms of ice storms, where we had power loss and hydro poles damaged related to that weather event of the ice storm. So how do we then look at integrating climate change considerations within current asset management systems and processes? So in that survey from the Canadian Infrastructure Report Card, they found that for small municipalities with populations less than 50,000, about 10% of those municipalities looked at integrating climate change considerations within asset management plans. For larger municipalities, there's an increase to 27% for medium to large populations greater than 400,000. Interconnected with this and related to how we look at managing processes from a technical point of view or financial point of view, we also have an increasing or developing landscape with respect to regulations. So within Ontario, recently we have the regulation for asset management planning for municipal infrastructure. It's an incremental process or approach that builds on the 2012 Asset Management Guide. There has been engagements and consultation with review and refinement of that regulation and process. It's been targeted in terms of looking at strategic asset management policies and asset management plans and processes. And it's a phased approach looking at defined requirements and milestones over time. So from that brief overview and the relationship of the project to asset management, we see that there's a large degree of complexity and also interrelationships between stakeholders at various levels, whether this is in the community, the public, the municipal staff, government agencies, both at the provincial and federal level, and also externally to that in academia or in professional societies such as engineers or financial consultants and management consultants. So I won't go through that particular slide here in detail, but we can see that there are a number of elements that all are interconnected within that asset management system that play a role. So now we go to just looking at the project overview, and this is just looking at details of the specific elements of the project, some of which are presented here today and some of which will be presented in the future. So the project looked at two main phases and looking at two objectives from the perspective of climate change in its relationship with asset management and infrastructure. The first one, which is what we're going to focus on here today, is looking at the current state of readiness for municipalities to address climate change effects on asset performance and asset management, and in the future to develop a framework for use and adaptation integration by municipalities within that asset management practices. In terms of the readiness landscape methodology, there's a priority area number 1 where we're primarily looking at the readiness of rural municipalities to assess, measure the effects of climate change and how can we integrate climate change effects into asset management practices. So we conducted a literature review to look at both research that's been conducted, best practices, lessons learned and examples from other case studies. We also undertook a community perception survey that Dr. Dupre will look at and discuss later. And we'll also look at some municipal questionnaires where questions were then forwarded to representatives of municipalities through a series of questions looking at this particular priority area objective. So in terms of community perception survey, then I'll hand this over to Dr. Dupre, who will give that presentation. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So as Sean mentioned, I'm going to be discussing the part of the research program that focused on community perceptions of climate change. So just to begin and to provide a context for where we were coming from with this portion of the research and where we focused, we're using a psychological approach to understand individual perceptions, predictors, and outcomes of climate change and related environmental issues. We are using empirical evidence in the psychology and related areas to form research questions related to climate change. And what we did was an online survey, so we collected data online from residents of rural Ontario communities. So I'll go through a little bit of the background to this research and then discuss how we did it and what we found. So as Sean mentioned, my background is in organizational psychology, and what we've seen over the last 10 years or so is that awareness and importance associated with climate change and environmental issues has really escalated in over the course of those years. So there's been more focus on the fact that organizations and employees see that they need to be or they want to be addressing these issues. It has also now captured the attention of the broader research community. So we see academic associations focusing on the fact that we really need to be focusing our research efforts in this area to try to come to a better understanding of what it is and how these issues are affected, what the outcomes are, what affects our views on them, our perceptions on them, our beliefs on them. So we do need more empirical evidence to support organizational decisions, policies, and practices in this area. So even though it's a relatively new area in the sense that the research isn't as developed as it is in some other areas, we do have a growing body of evidence and we do know something so far. So in terms of what we know and some of the things that we know that informed this portion of the research, there is evidence for positive outcomes when workplaces and organizations implement green policies and procedures. At the same time, we know there's some costs associated with that, but we do know that on average, there seems to be more positive outcomes associated with these types of initiatives. So from an environmental perspective, we see a reduced carbon footprint, for example. From an organizational perspective, we see the ability for organizations to be able to attract and retain talent and the types of organizational employees that they're looking for. From an employee and customer perspective, we see greater pride in the organization, and at the societal level, we see improved living conditions. So just some examples of what research has found thus far. We also know that there are certain factors that influence the success of environmental and climate-related organizational policies and initiatives, as well as individuals' perceptions of climate change. So just to give you an example of some of the findings so far, We know that leadership can play a role, so leaders who are supportive of these types of initiatives seem to have an effect on the success of the policies and on individuals' perceptions of the importance of climate change and the role that it may play in an organization. Personal climate change beliefs play a role, so the beliefs that people hold individually. We also know that organizational and community characteristics play a role. So when people believe or feel that their communities or organizations are more resilient, when they're more attached to their organization, and when there's a lot of support for local industries, we also see that in those cases there tends to be a bit more success in terms of policies related to climate-related issues, and we see that individuals' perceptions of climate change tend to be a little bit more positive. And finally, we see that personal characteristics at times play a role. So gender, age, education, income, so these factors at times play a role in terms of influencing the success of these policies and also individuals' perceptions of climate change and environmental issues. So in terms of conducting this research in this area, we looked at these factors and argued, hypothesized, included them in our research in the sense that we argued that they may influence communities' ability to adapt to climate change. So when some of these are in place, it may be more likely that people are willing to accept certain climate-related initiatives or policies and things like that. At the same time, even though we have this growing body of research and we know more and more all the time, there's still some areas where the evidence is more limited. So for example, we have a couple of areas that we wanted to focus on in this research where there wasn't as much evidence to pull from. So in terms of a general understanding of climate change, research has shown that most people don't fully understand the definition of climate change or its effects. So in this research study, we wanted to look a little bit at, is there consensus across people within communities? Do people understand the relationship between weather-related events and climate change, just to get a better understanding of where individuals' understandings were within a community and what the level of consensus or disagreement was. We also don't know a lot about the support that people are willing to give to green or climate-related initiatives. So are they willing to make sacrifices in certain areas for different initiatives, for example, tax-related or service-related? And also, do community and individual characteristics really make a difference when it comes to the support that people are willing to give? So we know that there's some differences when it comes to people's perceptions of climate change, but when it gets right down to the support they're willing to give, how much of a difference do these factors make? So before we started our research study in this area, that was the background, and what we really felt that we needed to do with this portion of the research was better understand these areas. So before implementing any green-related policies, procedures, initiatives to mitigate some of the effects of climate change on rural Ontario communities, it's important to improve our understanding of community perceptions of the current infrastructure. So where do they feel satisfied or dissatisfied? Where do they feel that changes could be made? Levels of support could change, for example. We also felt that it was important to look at the current understanding of climate change and its effects. So do people have, what type of understanding do people have when it comes to the definition of climate change and the effects that it's having on their own communities? Openness to changes in procedures and policies surrounding climate change, and also getting back to those personal and community characteristics. So what are they and how do they relate to climate and environmental issues? So the study purpose was to examine the effects of personal and community characteristics of stakeholders, so people who are living in rural Ontario communities, on their openness to policy and infrastructure changes that could be made to increase the sustainability of their community in the face of climate change. So that was the overall purpose that we had when we started this research study. So a little more specifically, what we did, we had the assistance of a software company. Surveys were sent to over 7,600 residents of rural Ontario communities. And we received online data back from 2,500 residents of rural Ontario communities. So just to give you a sense of what these participants look like, the average age was 65. More than half of them were female. Almost all were Caucasian. More than half were married, and 3/4 of them had children. So now I'm just going to go through some of our results, keeping in mind that these are generalized results. There's, of course, always exceptions, and these are the views from the residents that we received information from. So we fully acknowledge that there may be differences of opinions with some of these findings, and that there, of course, may be exceptions. So in terms of community perceptions of current infrastructure, what we see is that over 50% of people are saying that they are currently satisfied with current infrastructure. On the other hand, there's around 30% who are saying that they're dissatisfied with current infrastructure. We further asked where people thought that improvements may be able to be made. And what we saw for the most part were people were making suggestions with regards to public transportation and roads. As I mentioned earlier, we were also interested in looking at whether people fully understood climate change from the perspective of the definition that's typically given in the scientific literature. So we asked people if they understood what climate change was, and over 70% said that they either somewhat understand it or do understand it. And then we provided people with the definition of climate change and asked, is their understanding the same as this definition? And again, we saw that most people do have that similar understanding. So when they were provided with the definition, they felt that their understanding of climate change was the same as the definition provided. At the same time, we did see that around 87% of people are at least a little concerned about the effects of climate change on their community. So people understand what it is, seem to understand what it is, and they're also concerned about what it might mean for their community and what those effects might be. We asked people about their views on the causes of climate change. And as you can see from this graph, 33% said there was human causes involved, and 54% said it was partly human or partly natural processes involved. In addition, sort of further to this idea, almost 70% of the sample said that they really don't have ideas about what can be done to address climate change. So they do see that there's human processes involved, but they don't necessarily see where we can make this connection to make some changes to have an impact on climate change in a positive way. So in terms of the information that community members are receiving about climate change, we asked how much information they feel that they're getting and if they're satisfied with this level of information from their community. 30% said that they're not at all satisfied with the level of information that they're receiving, and 26% that they're not really sure about that. And further to this, we asked how they receive information about climate change from their community, and 48% said that it was through television, and 35% said that it was through newspaper. We were also interested in finding out a little bit more information about how willing community members would be to adapt to climate change. So we asked what their willingness was. As you can see from the chart on the left side of this slide, 20% said they would be willing to, 24% said that they're somewhat willing to, 23% said that they're a little bit willing to. So overall, there was a lot of support for the notion that people are willing to make some changes or adapt in particular ways to climate change. We did go further and ask about some of the ways they may be willing to make changes to adapt for climate change. And some people said that they would be willing to pay more taxes, but on average we see that, or for the most part, we see that people are not willing to pay more taxes to adapt to climate change. We also asked if people would be willing to reduce the level of services they're provided with to adapt to any climate-related changes or policies. And again, we see here that most people are not willing to, although some people are. So there's a few people who are willing to make those changes, but we have 32% of people saying that they don't want to see any changes to the level of services when it comes to making changes related to climate change. We further asked if services were to be reduced, where would they want to see that reduction? And 56% said community services, while 30% said other. So as we go on in the results, I think it's an important point to mention is that we did see that community attachment and community resilience were very important in terms of people's feelings about climate change and environmental issues. So we present this sort of with caution, just saying that even though people said they'd be willing to accept some reduction in community services, it would be definitely something that would need to be really thought through and researched more before a particular community went through with that, because the community support and attachment and resilience seems so important in terms of people's acceptance of community changes with regards to climate and environmental issues. We also asked about the industries of participant communities, because this has been shown to be important in previous research. So what previous research has found is that where climate is having a big effect on certain industries that are important to particular communities, people at times tend to be more supportive of changes related to climate and environmental nature issues. So the main industries of participant communities that we looked at were agriculture, tourism, and retail. Then we further asked them about two industries, tourism and agriculture. We said, if tourism is the main industry of your community, do you see that it's being affected by, or do you believe that it's being affected by climate change? So for tourism, 43% said yes, and for agriculture, 18% said yes. So in terms of what we see in the literature, in terms of the effect that climate change is having on these industries, the responses are a little bit different than what we're seeing here. So what most research would suggest is that the effect is quite strong for these industries, but for example, for agriculture, people don't see it as having as big of an effect as the research would suggest. So overall, the analyses suggest that individuals who are older and female may be more concerned with the effects of climate change on their community. Again, this was based on our findings, and other studies have found differences, but in terms of what we found with this particular group of participants, older female participants tended to express more concern about the effects of climate change. Further, individuals who have an understanding of climate change, so they understand what it means and they understand what the effects of it could be. Individuals who are getting more information from their community, individuals who feel more attached to their community, and individuals who feel that their community is more resilient are also more likely to believe that something can be done to address climate change in their community, and they're more willing to pay higher taxes and reduce services to do so. So there does tend to be some characteristics of communities and feelings and perceptions about climate change, attachment to community that does have an impact on how willing people are to support initiatives related to environmental issues. A couple more overall findings. We saw that many are not satisfied with their current infrastructure, but at the same time, they don't perceive that climate change is influencing that infrastructure. So they don't see a connection there. So whether there is or is not, there is not a connection being viewed by community members. Many feel that they do understand climate change and its effects, but they don't perceive that it's affecting their primary industries, so those industries within their communities. Although many don't want to pay more taxes or receive less for services, they are open to adaptation practices and processes. And we also see that both community and personal factors are related to climate change beliefs. So some important overall findings that do have implications for how we could move forward, both from a practical and from a research perspective. In terms of implications in future research, based on this, we would argue that it's really important to, of course, continue researching in this area to try to replicate and extend these findings. But there is some information from the study that we can use to create and implement, at least start to create and implement climate change-related policies and practices. We argue that it's really important to continue to understand the factors that influence climate change perceptions and the effectiveness of adaptation practices, given what we found from this study. So they did play an important, predictive, significant role. We, in the future, think it's important to compare these findings to different groups of participants, so comparing to an urban sample as well as to different types of rural communities. So we acknowledge that we might not have addressed all types of rural communities with this methodology, so an online survey. And also to extend this research with additional community and personal characteristics, because there are, of course, others that could be potentially even more important than the ones we looked at. Also looking a little bit more at the effect of green policies on employees is something that's important. So looking at adults who are working for green organizations versus non-green organizations and some of the outcomes that might be associated with that. So job satisfaction, productivity, performance, health and well-being, attitudes towards work. As well, thinking a little bit about the effect of green policies on attracting new talent, just in terms of the value of these policies for organizations and the employees who work there. So in conclusion, in terms of, for this part of the webinar, rural residents say that they understand climate change, but don't necessarily understand the extent of its effects on their communities. The study does support the notion that certain individual and community characteristics are related to openness to climate change initiatives, even though we have a little bit more research to do in this area to really understand the connection. There's definitely support for this. And overall, the results suggest that both understanding climate change and community perceptions may increase willingness to support climate change initiatives. So thank you, and I'll turn it back over to Sean.
Thank you. I'll also just mention at this time as well to reiterate that please, if you have any questions, you can email directly to the Gmail address at the bottom of each of the slides. Also, the information provided in these slides will also be posted online. The last slide of this presentation will provide you that link in terms of the URL. So the information here will also be presented online at a future date. And the links will then be made available at the end of this slide presentation. So you could take a screenshot or a picture of that to note where that location will be. So the next phase of this discussion will look at municipal questionnaires that were submitted to representatives of the municipalities, whether they were in administrative, financial, or engineering and technical role. I'll go through the presentation, or the presentation will go through the results of these surveys, and we go through two of them. One is just a broad base survey looking at how climate change can be integrated within asset management plans. The other one was looking at trying to get a broader understanding of the enablers and barriers. That won't be presented here, but it will be presented at a future date. So in terms of the questionnaire framework, we were looking at primarily four key issues for rural Ontario municipalities to gain further understanding and insight on how climate change considerations may be integrated or brought into asset management plans and practices. And if climate change considerations have been integrated, what is the nature and extent of those considerations, and how could communities or municipalities look at climate change and extreme weather events with respect to their infrastructure vulnerability. For this particular study, we focused on rural Ontario municipalities. That was defined two ways, with a population base less than 100,000 people, and also a population density of less than 100 people per square kilometer. So before I get into the details of the survey results, I'll just get a cross-section of the questionnaire itself in terms of who responded to the questionnaires. So in Ontario, in terms of rural municipalities, we have a number of different types of single tier, lower tier, and upper tier municipalities, so a total of 409 that could be classified as rural. From that, we distributed the questionnaire to representatives at all 409 municipalities. We received responses from 160 of those municipalities. And throughout the questionnaires, both for the stakeholder surveys and the community surveys, the participation rate was somewhere between 30 and 40% for those studies. In terms of the questionnaire respondents for this particular study, roughly they were broken out evenly between single tier and lower tier at just around 50%, as shown on the right-hand side of the slide. In terms of the general location of the respondents to the survey, we see that a number or a larger majority, about 40%, was in the northern parts of Ontario and relatively evenly distributed throughout the west, central, and eastern parts of the province. In the GTA and Horseshoe area, that's not included in this particular study, as they would not be under the rural municipality definition. In terms of the population characteristics, the vast majority, almost 90%, had a population base of less than 25,000. And only 11% that was greater than 25,000. And this directly relates also to some of the elements of the regulation in terms of requirements and aspects of what's expected. We also asked the municipalities to provide information on the population change or annual growth trends. Majority are basically in a stable or neutral position at about 56% of that population, 56% of the representatives that responded to the survey. Around 21% were in a phase of accelerated growth, so greater than 1.5% change in the population on a per annum basis. Some were experiencing, around 15% were experiencing normal growth, and a small minority, around 8%, were establishing or experiencing negative growth or reduction in population. Some of this data then will still need to be looked at to see if there's correlations between locations, population change or trends in the annual growth, and also population base itself. Excuse me. We also asked or inquired upon how the asset management functions were delivered within the organization. So from within the municipality, most delivery of that asset management process or framework was through some sort of administrative or financial professional person. Around 10% was with the technical or engineering staff, and around 37% was within an integrated team that combined people from administration, finance, and engineering. Around 7% of the respondents had external consultants that would then liaise with the leads within those organizations or within the communities. Some have not established any process, but have started to think about how that process would occur. That was around 6%. And a small percentage was other, of 2%, and that could have been, for example, where they're thinking about how to actually combine resources and strategies with local communities and municipalities to try to leverage scale. In terms of the questionnaire outcomes, the summary of those outcomes were basically, we looked at three main issues. So the integration of those climate change considerations. If climate change has been considered, what's the nature and extent of those climate change considerations, and also the characterization of infrastructure vulnerability to climate events. So in terms of integrating climate change within asset management plans, around 77% of those respondents said they haven't performed that particular task yet. In terms of looking at moderating factors as to why that may occur, of those respondents, 77% did not have any existing sustainability plans, or they're in the process of conducting future studies that would look at sustainability. And 66% did not have any formal public engagement on the issue of climate change in relationship with asset management plans. So that may be some uncertainty in terms of how, I'll get into some of the details on another slide, but it may be related to uncertainty in terms of leadership or direction and not clear understanding of what that process going forward should be. So in terms of that limiting factor, they were polled in terms of what they believe to be the major factors limiting the integration of climate change within asset management plans and processes. 19% thought that the major limiting factor was lack of awareness. There was another group of then areas where there was awareness, but they thought other factors were limiting in that aspect. So in terms of awareness, the majority were looking at lack of resources, but also some respondents thought there was limited management support coming down to help that integration. There was also limited public support, which then maybe both of these factors may be coming back to the uncertainty as to why the public engagement has not occurred. And there was also 13%, or a small minority, looking at there was insignificant reasons to look at climate change considerations within asset management plans. Out of all of these responses to limiting factors, 25% had multiple responses. So although the number of respondents was around 160, there was also some suggestion that the integration of climate change effects and considerations within asset management plans was a uncertainty or not clear understanding of how the vision, policy, and strategies are linking with the tactical or operational aspects in terms of systems and plans, and how we move asset management plans forward to think about climate change risk and events and extreme weather events with the impact on infrastructure in terms of performance and sustainability. A second part was then if climate change considerations were then integrated or being considered within asset management plans, were there adaptive management strategies being used to address that inherent uncertainty with climate events, extreme weather events on infrastructure and infrastructure performance? The majority have not looked at management strategies, with 77% responding no. There were, however, some minority, 19%, that said they were either had looked at adaptive management strategies or have looked at it to some degree or extent. And another minority of around 2% looked at other tools being developed by third parties, for example, such as the BARC tool on the middle of the slide or the PIEVC protocol on the right-hand side. So there is some mobility or direction by a minority number of municipalities within rural Ontario, looking at how we can integrate adaptive management strategies, take consideration of climate change within asset management plans. So we're around 21%, or we're looking at that effect. Basically, from the nature and extent of those considerations within asset management plans, what I'd call the front end of that is fairly well established. So when we think about the planning, thinking about awareness to climate events and how that may impact climate change, so collection of data, understanding the data, interpreting the outcomes from that data set, or assessing the impacts on infrastructure and vulnerability, that front end is fairly well established. Where it seems to be more room for improvement is on the risk control side. So how do we actually assess, from a technical point of view, the risk and vulnerability of the infrastructure? And how do we develop adaptation controls for that infrastructure to mitigate or adapt to the climate change events? Particularly when we're trying to make sure that those mitigation strategies or adaptation practices will, in the long run, be effective, both from a utility point of view, so from an engineering point of view, that you're going to meet the desired fitness for purpose, or an economic view that it's going to be the right decision in the long run, so that we're not spending money in a way that we need to come back and readdress some of the issues that may arise from an incorrect decision. So there's a large number of uncertainty in terms of climate change effects on that side. So the right-hand side of the slide, where we think about risk control, that is looking to be having areas for room for improvement. The following few slides, I'll go through some of the data. I won't go through it in a particular level of detail. One thing you'll note at the bottom right-hand side, you'll see a number, which is, in this case, 39. That's representing the number of responses to a particular question. And in this particular case, we have only 14 respondents for this area, for the nature and extent of climate change considerations in asset management plans with respect to the planning. So from that, we see from the overall survey where we have 160 respondents, we have a very small pool to actually assess the data set, and also a small pool in the sense of these are the municipalities that are moving forward looking at climate change effects within asset management practices. From that, we can though see some general trends in terms of, again, the front end part, the planning exercises, fairly well established. There's multiple selections for each of these defined criteria that was asked in the survey. So for example, established champions or leader, assessing the knowledge or competency for the project. So some of these would have multiple selections for a particular response. So for example, in terms of the defined purpose objective statement and identified knowledge or resource needs, they would have been a coupled response. The second part of the examination for the nature and extent of these considerations was looking at how do we improve awareness. So in terms of, for example, looking at gathering scientific knowledge. And again, 12 respondents, and the multiple selections in this case is 24. But we see a broad range or across the board in terms of improving awareness, so gathering data to better understand and have evidence to actually make informed decisions. Looking at historical data and looking at trends of how they've changed over time. And certainly areas in terms of flooding risk, there's been a significant volume of work over the last decade looking at improving models for prediction and also assessing vulnerability of infrastructure and risk, both from a financial point of view and also engineering. In terms of the third step within this process or the questionnaire, looking at the process for integrating climate change risks, we're looking at assessing potential impacts. Again, we have a low number of respondents, but a higher number of multiple selections. So in this case, we have 35 selections. So that we have a broad range of multiple selections across all respondents that have looked at potential impacts, whether they're compiling the inventory data, looking at hazard and vulnerability maps, or developing consequence maps. So there's been, again, at the front end, a significant amount of work and fairly well being established in terms of developing that front end of understanding what the events that may influence how infrastructure performs, how that's going to be tied back into asset management plans, data collection and interpretation of that data. Excuse me. In terms of the risk control process, the other area where I thought that there's a general need or improvement to be had over time, we're looking at assessing risks and infrastructure vulnerabilities. So the process or risk assessment process itself is the most significant one in which there's been progress. And as mentioned earlier in one of the slides, there are protocols such as the BARC tool or the PIEVC tool protocol that have been developed and have been used for addressing some of these issues. And in terms of establishing adaptation controls, we see less respondents and also less multiple interactions. So there are areas where, for example, that the 0% shows that these aspects for this particular survey haven't been addressed within the municipalities while they were trying to look at climate change effects on infrastructure and how it relates to asset management. So the primary one is just looking at adaptation practices has been the most significant step forward in terms of the analysis. In terms of infrastructure vulnerability, which was the third component of that survey, as these are all rural municipalities, we see correlations with what type of core infrastructure are considered to have been impacted by climate change effects, and these are more related to stormwater and roads, bridges, and buildings, facilities as well. In this particular case as well, we see at this component of that survey, the third component, which is basically looking at either recorded data or anecdotal evidence about what kind of infrastructure components are being influenced by climate change and weather events. We see that the number of respondents here has now increased back up significantly in terms of 378. Again, the total pool of responders or people responding to the survey was 160. So in this case here we see that there are multiple selections by each individual respondent as well. So we could have roads and bridges being affected by climate change, for example. In terms of climate change effects, what kind of weather-related events have been experienced? The primary one is looking at precipitation or rainfall with other aspects of climate change in terms of changes in temperature, extreme heats or heat wave, erratic variations in that temperature, or snowfall, for example, as well, to lesser degree. But the main one is rainfall. And primarily this is related to not necessarily larger volumes, but more intensity of the rainfall itself that's happening. In terms of the hazards impacting infrastructure, we would expect to see as well, if rainfall is one of the main extreme weather events, that we'd also see those issues cascading out into flooding impacts on the infrastructure. Although we also see freeze-thaw and to a lesser degree soil erosion as primary hazards impacting infrastructure for this particular focus group. In terms of adverse effects on infrastructure, from a vulnerability point of view, we see that this is more or less, in terms of damage, deterioration at different levels, to different degrees that may have more or less impact, greater impact on this fitness for service, and what we need to do in order to bring it back into the desired levels of service that we are looking at as a target. We see that this has a wide range of variation, and both going from temporary loss of function to permanent loss in that function, which is significant damage or need of replacement. So in closing most of the seminar today, I just wanted to also present some of the aspects of the future direction of the project. So the particular aspects we looked at today was on the first phase, trying to get a better understanding of the landscape for communities in rural Ontario, of how municipalities are dealing with or addressing climate change within asset management plans and also within the management of the infrastructure and core assets. From that, we see that there is a front-end process in terms of collection of data, getting a better understanding of what the critical issues are in terms of what kind of weather events, what kind of hazards are impacting your infrastructure is well developed. On the calculated side, in terms of the risk control, in terms of defining the actual risk or vulnerability, the risk to the actual vulnerable infrastructure, that's an area of improvement. We see other areas that need to be improved, such as codes and standards, for example. Although in the north, in the Canadian north, there has been some work done over the last few years, looking at snow loads, for example. And we also see in British Columbia, we see the development of a new best practice for highway or transportation systems that have integrated climate change effects as well. So we see that there are some elements of both the front-end component and the risk control side being developed over time. The future project direction here is to then look at some of these aspects in the Ontario context. So in terms of these phase 2 activities, in terms of these slides here, I just want to present an overall view of what would be expected to come out in terms of future webinars and also publications. So we have 4 main tasks that are basically looking at this second priority area, which is basically once we've established an understanding of the current readiness landscape, how do we move that forward? If we keep in mind also the other constraints or aspects in terms of the regulations on asset management and the requirements for climate change considerations. The first task is really looking at how can we actually support the integration of that climate change within asset management plans. And so there's a series of key activities underneath that task that are listed. I won't go through each of the activities in detail here. It is more for information just to have as a placeholder so we can see what is coming down in the future. From development of that supporting elements of the climate change integration, we'll move that forward to look at practical applications through both a scoping study and a case study. From those outcomes and learnings, we'll then try to advance best practices for integrating climate change effects within asset management plans, both from a financial point of view and also engineering. And from that, we'll synthesize the results, disseminate that through reports, through webinars, through social media, and through publications, and also a workshop. From that, we'll get feedback from both the steering committees internally and also the public at large when the workshops occur. In terms of knowledge transfer, just to provide an overview, there is a website. That website will have the presentation uploaded at a future date. In terms of the conference publications, what we have to date so far is one I'll present at a Canadian Society of Civil Engineers conference in Fredericton in 2 and a half weeks. We also are presenting the information or outcomes from the rural community perception of climate change surveys. And that's at a conference within San Francisco And there's a roundtable discussion that both Catherine and Amanda will be attending, and that's looking at how climate change effects within the social context is being discussed. Also within social media, I'll provide updates through the Twitter account, and future webinars and workshops will be broadcast through those sites as well in terms of the social media Twitter account, through the website, and through the database that we have in terms of contact information. Finally, I'd like to thank you for taking your time here today to listen to this webinar. Certainly, I see some questions that have come in over time during the course of this webinar, and that's greatly appreciated. If there are any other questions, please feel free to send them now. Amanda has been actually busy trying to correlate and synthesize these questions coherently for us, and we'll be able to respond to that. We'll present the question and then present our answers to that as best we can. If after the presentation you still have questions, please feel free to send it to that Gmail account, and we'll try to follow up as quickly as we can. And again, I'd like to thank you for attending the presentation, and if there are any questions, we'll welcome them now. Thank you. So, I'm sorry. I'm not sure that if there is a question about getting audio working, and would it be possible to get a recording of the webinar to watch at a later date? That's certainly going to be the case. I'm not sure if it's going to help the person that has trouble with audio right now, but I will try to update that through both social media and through the contact list that we have to try to get that information out. So there's also one on the social community surveys as well.
Okay, so the question is, sorry, you mentioned age and gender, but what about race or religion when it comes to accepting climate change initiatives and policies? So there is some previous research on this. Amanda might just add something in here, and I'll just repeat it as she does. So there is some previous research that has looked at this, and we did include this in our study. We did not include religion, but we looked at race. So race was measured, but we didn't find any group level differences. And the reason for that is probably because this group of participants was largely Caucasian, so 95% of them were. So to be able to find any differences is really impossible with such a I don't want to say bias, but to some extent biased sample, because really what we were looking at was a group of Caucasians in the sample. So we didn't see any differences. So we didn't measure religion, but definitely will be an interesting demographic variable to look at in the future. There's a little bit of research that has looked at that, but not very much, but it will be something that would be interesting to look at more. And some people who we've discussed this research with have commented on that it may be an important factor for rural communities. So that might be something that we could include in future research, thinking about different individual and community characteristics. We also asked about political affiliation. So the majority of communities reported that they were conservative, so individuals within those communities were 60%.
It was actually the communities were 60% conservative, but they were pretty evenly split across personal political affiliation.
Okay, so the communities were reported as being 60% conservative, but it was quite evenly split across the individuals who completed the survey. Conservative respondents were more satisfied with the current infrastructure and tended to believe that climate change is caused by natural causes. Liberal and NDP respondents tended to believe that something can be done to address climate change and will be willing to reduce their services. So on average, that's what we tended to see with this sample. Again, adding in that there's always exceptions and changes, and it depends on the people that you're looking at, but with the sample, that's what we found. Another question focused on the geographical distribution of the survey results. So we did ask participants to indicate their particular community, and they typed this out, so it wasn't a choice that they could select from, but they specifically indicated the community that they were in. And it's, I'd say, probably complicated analysis to just a time-consuming, not complicated, but more time-consuming analysis to go through and group those, and we have not yet done that, but we are able to do that, or we will be able to do that in the future.
Some of the main ones are.
So some of the main ones Amanda just brought up while we were speaking. So there were a large number of participants from Belleville, Brockville, Cobourg, Cornwall, Huntsville, North Bay, Owen Sound, Peterborough, Sarnia, and Sault Ste. Marie. And there were many, many more. So it was, I don't know if I want to say that it was a bigger number than we expected, but it was a very huge range of participants from different communities. So we do need to go through and group that. And again, a few other people have commented that might be an interesting analysis, or even breaking down those rural communities into different categories may be interesting to look to see if there's any differences across those. So we will do that in the future.
Okay. So there's also I should add as well, so from these questions that we're answering here or any other that come through in Gmail, we'll try to coalesce these into common themes and provide a response, and then also update the website with those responses. So from the next one is looking at in climate action planning, we look at a transformational goal, innovation, and the ability to replicate or scale up climate solutions. We also look at solutions that have strong co-benefits, such as enhancing our quality of life, creating jobs, or reducing individual and societal costs. With respect to asset management and resilience in the face of climate change and extreme weather, are we looking at buttressing conventional infrastructure, or are there transformational goals and a focus on co-benefits? Certainly, Kate and Amanda may have some other responses as well to some of these aspects in terms of quality of life and societal inputs. From the engineering point of view, I guess it'll also depend upon where the community resides in terms of the population growth and trends. How do we see that population size and the management of that system in terms of devising solutions? Certainly, in terms of replacement costs of existing infrastructure, if we're looking at, say, a single-lane bridge, that will be different if we have to think about adaptation strategies, for example, of higher water levels or erosion at the foundation levels. We would then think about, in that case, probably transformational type changes to that infrastructure. Certainly, we have to then look at balancing what our mitigation schemes and adaptation strategies are within, obviously, a cost-effective and technical point of view, because we want to be able to deliver those services that are at the minimum desired levels or codified levels, and also do that within a framework from an engineering point of view that can meet both the function and the cost over the life cycle. I'm not sure if you want to add anything to society, and then I'll think if any, we'll add some more.
Right. I mean,
response.
I think I briefly touched on this earlier, but the area is so new, and they're really, compared to a lot of other areas, there's so little evidence compared to what we know about other topics from an organizational behavior and organizational psychology perspective, that we don't have a huge body of evidence to draw from. But as we mentioned earlier, there's definitely growing evidence that there are benefits, and the benefits seem to be outweighing the costs associated with these initiatives. I think at times, given that the evidence is so new, it's difficult to make the case perhaps as to what all the benefits are, but I think that evidence is growing, and it strongly suggests that as it continues to grow, we'll see more benefits for individuals, for families, for communities, for organizations, for employees, and for society at large. I think that's the way it's looking. And of course, there's always going to be costs associated with it. For particular individuals, maybe there will be costs associated with it. I think there's still a lot of research to be done, but I think overall what we're seeing is we need more evidence to be able to strongly make that case so that people can see what the benefits are, but it's definitely moving in that direction.
And I guess, as I thought a little bit more about it, I guess in terms of my own perspective, I'm not sure that I view it to be transformational, but certainly as we think about approaches both of trying to, as civil engineering has evolved over time, I think it's becoming a lot more complex in terms of the relationships of how we think about looking at infrastructure from an engineering point of view. So rather than just a very pure technical viewpoints, we have to bring in other aspects such as urban planning. If we think about societal needs and impacts and ability to use infrastructure for given levels of service, which is different from what we looked at asset management in the past of just looking at purely as a functional role. That would be, I think, to me, is incremental. Maybe you could argue it's transformational. Certainly the work done by the BC Professional Engineering Society in terms of starting the development of best practices, in this particular case for transportation systems, that integrate climate change effects is also a way forward or a path forward. Also, when we think about in scaling, for sure, there's been cases of New York City, in the Greater Toronto area, where they have experienced flood events with significant cost and also failures of particular pieces of infrastructure. How do you bring that down to the levels of where we're thinking about, in this particular case, of population centers that are less than 25,000 people? Certainly parts of the aspect of phase 2 is to look at some of those scales to try to better understand, well, how can we collect information or data on a broader scale that could be used by a number of local regional municipalities, whether they're within the same region, because sometimes the municipal regions and watershed boundaries aren't necessarily in the same region. They may overlap. So how do we think about getting both intergovernmental organizations communicating together? How do we think about getting that engagement both with the community at large in terms of population? How do we then get that communication going from top down in terms of the council leadership and senior management in terms of understanding what kind of strategies that we're going to try to pursue? So these are all things that from a historically, in an engineering sense, we would have less consideration of, but as we move forward in time, project management, societal psychology, organizational behavior, these are all aspects that are coming into what we need to think about in terms of developing solutions going forward. So I hope that also helps to clarify as well. Another one, I guess, is also somewhat related. Are there approaches where climate change and adaptation strategies have been addressed? And this relates back to aspects where both the City of New York over the last decade or more, and also the Greater Toronto Area, looking at aspects of how flooding events have impacted their infrastructure. How do they think about then changing their approach in terms of how they manage assets? And if we think of a timeline or changes in how we approach that, we can think about even just from a water context, where we're looking at before of gray infrastructure and now moving into more of a green infrastructure environment, and looking at how can we try to reduce that dependency of hard contact surfaces such as asphalt or concrete to become more permeable, for example, so that the rainwater or precipitation isn't just pooling or ponding on top of a rigid surface, but are able to then percolate through into the ground, or we have other open channels so that we can actually either retain the water or for eventual release into the environment, so that we can overcome some of the aspects related to very intense precipitation that's becoming more frequent. I'm not sure if there's any others that... so some of the other ones are looking also at best practices for climate change integration. Certainly some of that has also been touched upon in terms of Standards Council looking at aspects for the Canadian North in terms of climate change and how do we address both for transportation infrastructure and also foundations in the face of decaying permafrost or deteriorating permafrost conditions, which impacts the foundation for both facilities or buildings and also roads or transportation systems. And there's certainly a large number of test sites or case studies being conducted to look at adaptation strategies for the North. So I think this one may be more for Kate to address.
Right, so there's a couple questions related to how an urban sample, urban group of participants or an urban community may be different from a rural community. We've talked a little bit about this, the research team, and then there's also some previous research on this as well, so bringing all that together. We've argued that it may be a little bit different in terms of their satisfaction with infrastructure and possibly their concerns related to that. So maybe there's differences in terms of the services that are most important to them given the different location in terms of where they're living. And similar to that, there may be differences within different types of rural communities. So something that someone has mentioned to us a couple times is that there may be these differences depending upon the actual size of the rural communities, and that there are significant differences depending upon the services available to a particular size of rural community. Possibly in terms of thinking about rural communities, there's differences with regards to the primary industries. So if it was, for example, like tourism versus forestry or fishery, we may see differences. We found that although participants supported the industries, they didn't necessarily think that or believe that or see yet that they were being affected by environmental changes or climate-related issues. But that could differ across urban communities or different types of rural communities. So that would be interesting to see and understand why that might be the case. Again, when the main industry is very dependent on weather, that might have a significant impact on these views and perceptions and beliefs related to climate change and environment. So being aware of that and understanding that and then looking at those differences might be something that's important to research, and then also thinking about how we move forward with implementing different policies and practices related to any government or organizational initiatives. There's also a couple questions about the individual difference findings. So why would women care more about climate? Why would younger people care more? There's a lot of differences across the research. So research findings have varied, right, with regards to this. So I wouldn't want to say that this is the way it is given these findings. Given this group of participants that we looked at, this is what we found. We did have a sample that tended to be a little bit older and that was comprised of more women, so that might have implications for the way the data played out. At the same time, some people have suggested that at times, perhaps women may be a little bit more family-oriented. Sometimes they're higher on conscientiousness. That might make them feel a little bit differently about the environment, as well as the effects on children and families. There's also some research to support the notion that young people at times are more aware of environmental issues because they need to live with it for a longer period of time. And it's something that's just more within the realm of what they're understanding and learning about. So that might be why they care a little bit more about it. Again, some of these ideas are supported by research, but we really need more research to be able to understand those differences and to be able to provide a more definitive explanation of why that's the case, but there are some suggestions as to why that might be so.
And a specific sample, so it was older, mostly white, had high income, pretty educated, so that could.
Right, so Amanda just wanted to add that we fully acknowledge that our particular group of participants probably played a role in that. So they were older, Caucasian, more female, had higher levels of income and higher education, so there may be findings that are related to that more so than what we would see across a wider, more representative sample of rural communities, rural community members.
I'm not sure, we could add as well, I guess also from that community survey, as we went through the process of collecting that information for the people that are responding, in some ways it's a random survey, but it's also limited in terms of the overall size. Do you remember, I can't remember how many in total we had?
For the community?
Yeah, for the community survey.
2,500.
So it was about 2,500 respondents in a pool that had to be limited by the context of this particular project in terms of how rural municipalities were defined.
And they had to be able to respond to the survey online, which of course may have limitations, so some people might not have the resources to be able to do that. So again, that creates differences in terms of who we're getting our information from and what the results are.
A lot reported that they had internet issues, so like that could limit some people from being able to complete it.
Right, and an issue that was, Amanda's adding, an issue that was mentioned, so in some questions we asked what another concern might be, and a frequent comment was internet issues. So that probably has implications for who responded to our survey and some of the concerns they're having, right?
So one question is of how can municipalities integrate the information presented in the webinar? I think certainly from the community perception, I think in terms of importance of how people view climate change relative to their infrastructure, their expectation on service levels, and what they're willing to accommodate in terms of changes, whether that's taxes or service levels. I think that's an important aspect that needs to then continue forward, which is more related, again, I guess, also to both gaining data or evidence to support your decisions in terms of either policies, developing sustainability plans, thinking about your master plan or your strategic plan from a municipal point of view, and trying to then integrate those within both from the policy perspectives, but also from your technical asset management, because you're going to need to then to be able to address how you're going to integrate climate change considerations within those asset management practices so that you can meet both the stakeholder community expectations, the council or corporate expectations, and also deliver that tactically or operationally. I think from the engineering viewpoint, in terms of if we want to think about the municipal type questionnaires, I think in some ways it's somewhat limited at this particular phase. In the second phase, I'll just go back to the slides. I think it'll become more, the opportunities for municipalities to leverage outcomes will become greater in the phase 2 activities. I think in the current phase 1, certainly if the municipality can place themselves within that cross-section, they could get a better understanding of where they are in terms of the landscape of that there are a limited number of communities or municipalities that have looked at addressing climate change and adaptation. And those communities that have gone down that path are well on their way to trying to be able to get that process and framework in place to move forward and integrate climate change considerations within asset management plans. For a lot of the other communities, certainly the smaller level communities, this is still will be a challenge. But that's also part of the goals of the phase 2 activities, is try to better understand, well, what kind of information do we need? How can we interpret or use that information? For example, can we collect that information using conventional surveys? Can we also think about other ways of doing that, such as remote sensing using satellites or drones or unmanned aerial vehicles? Can we collect that data information to get an understanding of, on a broad scale, how is the climate change or hazards affecting infrastructure, so that we can take that data and make more informed decisions about the performance, the nature of that vulnerability, and move that forward. So I think from the overall discussion here today, certainly the municipality can place themselves within that context and see where they are on the landscape. Based on the cross-section of responses. As I said, I think the front end of that adaptive management strategies is well developed for those municipalities that have pursued this avenue. There are protocols available, as I said earlier, with BARC or PIVC protocols. Those certainly have been used at larger scales than very small rural communities. And also for specific aspects of types of infrastructure, so for example, airports. So I think there is a way to go forward. It's going to be incremental, and I think the greater leverage will come from the outcomes from the phase 2 activities.
Okay.
That's it.
Last question? Okay, so there's one last question here about what would our next research questions be. For the community perceptions part of this research, I think we would probably move forward with looking a little bit about differences across different types of communities, just trying to replicate and understand or replicate and extend our understanding of what we found so far. So, looking at different types of individuals, different types of communities, and seeing, can we see really what are the individual and community and organizational characteristics that are playing a role in influencing people's perceptions and understandings. Maybe looking a little bit more at the types of services and where, because people said they were willing to make changes and adapt in particular ways, but then there was quite a lack of clarity around where people were willing to make those changes. So maybe trying to look at that, I think because of what we saw, we probably are able to look at that a little bit more deeply in terms of understanding where are people willing to make these changes, what type of changes would they be supportive of, do they need more information before they're willing to make those changes, so maybe some intervention studies, and then just digging a little deeper in terms of some of what we saw with regards to their perceptions and beliefs, and a little bit about that disconnect between understanding climate changes, understanding some of the effects, but then not really seeing what it means for their own communities and maybe what they can do within their own communities.
So that was it. Okay. Well, I again, in closing, I think if I was going to sort of try to bring a closing statement, I would say that this particular research study is a component of a larger or broader view of research that's ongoing from the understanding and the significance and importance of both climate change, the effects on society, whether that's from a financial insurance point of view, whether it's from which obviously affects people from a personal point of view in terms of flooding, from an asset management, which is municipalities' perspectives, or engineering consulting. And also thinking about a large piece of work or ongoing work that's outside of this particular group, such as in Western Ontario University or in Waterloo, looking at how can we better move forward climate change risk models. Also through third parties as well, such as Federation of Canadian Municipalities, in terms of funding opportunities, coming also from the federal government in terms of both developing a capacity at the municipal level to develop asset management plans, and also thinking about green initiatives and also expectations of climate change and adaptation within municipal daily lives. So I think there's a broad base of understanding of the importance. There's also a broader group or area of people doing research, and both from an applied research and a practical application of that research. So that as we move forward, I think that foundation will become stronger, and we'll be able to develop greater capacities across that cross-section of municipalities, both at small to large cities. And I hope that you have taken some things from this presentation. And I thank you for actually sitting through and listening to us. Very much appreciated. And again, if you have any other questions, please feel free to contact myself here. The information for the website is shown, or send an email to the Gmail account, and we'll try to respond as soon as we can. Thank you.
Thanks.